So just a couple of quick comments. So all the ideas we've presented tonight, next year, Eddie Game and myself we're going to have a book published on conservation planning, and it'll cover all the topics you've heard. So by next summer, we hope that book will be out there, and it's really aimed towards practitioners. And then secondly, we do have some time to entertain some questions about any aspects of conservation planning, but particularly the topics we spoke about tonight. We know we're sort of between you and drinks and dinner, but if you have some questions, we're all here to try and answer them.
Hi guys, really excited to see mental models up there a few times, and so I actually have a question to the panel, or perhaps Craig and Eddie, who've potentially dealt with this, but looking at the mental models from Mirena's slides and moving into Eddie's theory of change, I realized that really when we develop a theory of change, we're just capturing individual people's mental models of how we think our actions might influence our outcomes. So we've been doing this with managers on an invasive species management problem, and we had this great idea that we do a sort of shared mental model or a single theory of change. And the hard issue that we're faced with is that we might have some motivational biases, strong motivational biases, and power dynamics. And we're actually at a complete loss as to how to navigate this group of 15 people to come up with a theory of change that doesn't necessarily reflect power dynamics or real issues. So I'd love to hear ideas.
I think it's a fabulous question for Marina.
Good. I'm sleeping in the same room as her. I don't know. I guess, how would I navigate it? I guess the only way of navigating it for me would be to have meeting after meeting after meeting. And I know you don't have the resources for it, but basically what you have is a conflict, and you have to solve that conflict. Or you have to somehow structure your decision towards a goal where where you can solve the conflict. So maybe making everything really explicit, why people believe in certain things, and just kind of digging in and digging in and digging into the theories of change. And at some point, you're going to meet convergences, I guess.
Yeah, maybe you don't need to converge them. I mean, I've seen some really nice work that some guys from WWF in Italy did, where they were getting different groups to build cognitive maps for the same task, but then they sort of divided them by the distinctions in their cognitive map, and then they actually used those to then build Bayesian belief networks of it, and it was really, really cool work, but it didn't take that long for them to characterize the different groups' cognitive maps, and they learned a great deal from the differences in how people view the system, so maybe you don't need one.
Questions?
Hi, I'm Ian Herford, a planner with the Department of Parks and Wildlife in Western Australia. I'm interested in the contention that you can only prioritise actions. I see plans as dynamic and adaptive things. It's mainly the actions that adapt. The objectives, the higher level stuff, stays relatively straight throughout the life of a plan in most instances. Occasionally you'll get a brand new piece of information and you need to radically change an objective. I would have thought that the solid thing, the thing you would prioritise, might be outcomes rather than actions. That way, if you are pursuing an action that is not working, it automatically loses any priority it had. The outcome stays the same, and something else that achieves that outcome lifts in its priority. Comments?
Yeah, I actually think we may be talking about the same thing, and I probably didn't express it very well, because I completely agree. It's almost like a triangle of the frequency with which things should change, and I think there are those sort of fundamental outcomes that you're talking about, the same thing that Craig mentioned. They should, hopefully you do a good enough job that they shouldn't change very often. But the way I see it is that because they are the lens that you should judge everything by, you don't need to prioritise those things. In a sense, all of those should be roughly equivalent, if that makes sense. And if you're prioritising between objectives, it's sort of, you think of it as being sort of unnecessary, because you may not have options that affect them differentially. So if you put a lot of weight on one objective over another objective before you know how the potential actions will affect them, you could say exacerbate a very minor difference between two actions, which actually makes it more difficult to make a good decision, because you're not getting kind of a true picture of what each of your actions are doing. You're prematurely weighting, you're prematurely evaluating your objectives, I would say.
Come on, who's going to be last? We all want to go. I want to go. One more burning question?
I'm interested to hear the opinion of the panel in terms of setting timeframes. So in terms of that discussion to do with what is a long-term goal as opposed to an action which is potentially of a shorter time frame.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you just to repeat it. It's a question about the right time frames?
Well, we're working with natural systems which operate, we hope, in perpetuity. So I work for New South Wales National Parks. I'm the team leader for planning for New South Wales. And this is, in terms of when we're phrasing plans of management, which we have that for all reserves, or we're aiming to have that for all reserves. There's no statutory time frame for how long a plan lasts, and there's no time frame for when the park ends. So in terms of what is a long-term objective as opposed to a management action, this is something we're wrestling with at the moment, because we have different layers of planning and different types of objective setting. How do those then interact with one another in terms of that planning time frame in providing consistency across 867 reserves? Could you solve that for me quickly? That'd be great.
Well, I don't think I'm going to solve that problem for you, but I think we didn't talk about it tonight. But in terms of sort of what is becoming long term, I think obviously one of the things we really starting to think a lot about more is climate change and impacts from that. And in some parts of the world, I think climate change is going to really alter how we think about time frames and what's short and what's middle term and what's long term. I mean, a lot of colleagues of mine, for example, that work in the Arctic, you can't think anymore necessarily and call something sort of long term being 25 or 50 years, because there's so much that's changing so fast about Arctic ecosystems. And you could say that about a lot of different, ecosystems. So, what's long term, I think, certainly is going to have to be a bit sort of ecosystem dependent. And I don't know the different types of ecosystems that you're dealing with, and I certainly don't have a sort of concrete answer for you about that interchange between sort of shorter term goals and longer term. But from a practical standpoint, it's in an organization, even a big complicated conservation organization like the one that Eddie and I work, for example, the Nature Conservancy, it's difficult to think in the near term more than sort of 3 to 5 years out. Honestly, I mean, just in terms of changes in leaders, changes in budgets, changes in income. You know, if you're foolish really to think about, you know, I'm going to, you know, do this more than the next 3 to 5 years. I think, you know, I really feel like that's for us in a big organization like that, that's a reasonable thing to think about. I mean, in terms of government agencies, this is true certainly worldwide. I mean, you get political administrations turning over. You know, it doesn't make much sense probably to think about shorter term actions beyond whatever the cycle is that an administration may turn over. I mean, you know, we're going to see that in a couple of years in the United States. And if I were a federal employee in a U.S. agency right now, I'd be thinking about what am I going to get done in the next 2 years, just in terms of short-term things, in terms of the, you know, the management of a place or in a natural resource agency. So I don't know how helpful that is to any of the rest of you. Have some thoughts on that?
Just the political sciences literature would say that you couldn't actually expect to understand the impacts of a policy before 10 years that you're implementing that policy. So I think at the moment we think about things in 3 years and 5 years circles, but it's to actually understand, just to implement a protected area plan will take you ages. Plus, to try to actually understand what the impacts of that protected area plan that you've just implemented is just, you know, I think you're thinking at least 10 years.
Can I offer an uneducated view would be that you've got layers of things driven by different political agendas and by different timeframes. But we had a kind of a half answer in some of the presentations in the sense that given different timeframes, ends become means. And if you've got a longer goal, strategic goal, a fundamental objective on a 20 or a 30-year time horizon, you don't need to plan strategically narrowly in 3 to 5 years to achieve that goal, as long as you set up a series of options that, irrespective of which future arrives, which government or which administration, you're going to tend in that direction. And that's what I would mean by a robust decision under uncertainty, that you consider those futures and identify an option that leads you in that direction, irrespective of those futures.
Any other questions?
I think our work is done.
Thank you all for hanging in there with us.
Thank you.